So as we get started today, just a reminder that we're in the middle of our series, The F Words, which is kind of a funny name. But again, it's because the topics we're talking about all begin with the letter F. And our goal in this series is to just identify things that we can do in our lives that help us to get less stuck. Right? Sometimes we just get stuck and we don't know how to go forward. And there's some basic things that we can do that help us to do that. As we talked about last week, in the first part of our series, we talked about faith. And when we talk about faith, remember that what we said is that faith isn't some kind of magic formula. Faith is simply believing that something will do what it says it will do. And the reason that's important is because sometimes it doesn't feel like that's going to happen. And we can often get stuck because we don't feel like the things are going to go the way we expect them to. And so faith enables us to kind of carry on even when things aren't going as well. Now this week, our next F word actually reminded me of my very first brand new car I bought. And it's like not Ferrari, in case you're wondering. That was not it. But if you remember, now I'm kind of old. I started driving in the early 1980s. Bought my first brand new car in 1985. And in 1985, you may have remembered in that time frame, those of you that were there, that there was this kind of trend that was happening, which was the sports sedan. So you take these classic sedans, and the manufacturers would actually sell them with bigger motors in them and different kinds of transmissions and so forth. Well, that's my first brand new car. Now, that's not actually my car, but my car looked exactly like that. That is a 1985 Monte Carlo Super Sport. Now, just to kind of set the context is that, from the time I was 14, I'm not building myself. From the time I was 14, I'd worked, I'd saved my money. All the time I was in high school, I worked 3 jobs through the summer. So I've been saving for years to get to this kind of moment of buying this car. I'm not saying I'm awesome, I'm just saying my parents didn't give it to me. I actually did pay for it myself, is my only point there. Now, I love this car. And my car looked just like this, except I had plussed it. Like those stripes are actually decals. Well, I thought it would look cooler without the stripes. So I spent one entire weekend with a hairdryer peeling all those stripes off so it could look really sleek. I got the smoked out headlight covers onto it. And we have this weird thing you call a car bra. It's an odd name, but that kind of leather thing you wrap around the front to cover the grill and so forth. I had all that stuff on there, and I loved that car. And a couple months after I bought it, it's parked out in front of my house, and the lady who lives across the street takes her Cadillac and backs out of her driveway and slams into the driver's side of my car. Pulls forward, backs up, hits it again. Pulls forward, backs up, hits it again, this time dragging her bumper all the way down the side until it catches in the rear wheel well and pulls the car out sideways. And she then just drives off and leaves. Now, what I needed in that moment was forgiveness. Because she had just trashed my car. And I was still making payments, by the way. Right? And what happens when someone does that, right, is that you get upset at the event, but you also get really upset at them. And you kind of start to blame them, and you start to make up narratives about why don't they pay more attention, and what are they zipping around like that all the time for anyway? Now, this lady I'd known this lady since I was 8 years old. And she used to babysit me. And she was a really nice person, right? But she was kind of always in a rush. Her life was always just a little too busy. And she liked her Cadillacs, and Cadillacs are big, heavy cars, and they do a lot of damage. But she had insurance, I had insurance. It gets sorted out. Now, to be honest, the car was never quite the same, but it gets back to kind of normal. But if we're honest with ourselves, the thing in life that can kind of most cause us to get stuck is unforgiveness. That we have things that happen in our lives that make it really hard for us to extend forgiveness to someone. And when we do that, we're hanging on the pain when we do that. And that's going to have an impact on our lives because, we all have situations in our lives that come along that require forgiveness, and most of those are smaller things. We can kind of let them go. But then there are things that happen in our lives that are more, that they're just too big, and we feel like we can't let them go, or maybe they just hurt too much. Or for some of us, I think that there are some people who are just upsetting to us, that when they do something, it bothers us more than when other people do it, making it hard to let it go. And sometimes people do things to us that can't be fixed. Now, in the case of my car, my driver's side door never lined up the same ever again. Right? So every time I would close the door, it would squeak, and there was always this little gap. And it reminded me every time I looked at that and what had happened. Now, the upside is for me, because of that, I eventually realized that it was just a car and who cares, and cars do a job, whatever. But it took me a while to get to that place, But the thing is that by getting to that place, I was able to kind of move on. It was a small event in the scope of life. I'm sure my car is long compressed in a junkyard somewhere at this point. Or maybe not. It could still be out there, but probably isn't. But the thing is that if we're not willing to forgive people, no matter how big it is, and sometimes it feels too big to forgive, it impacts everything. Now, there are some things that it impacts that are super obvious. That if I don't forgive someone, whatever the situation is of course going to get worse. My relationship with that person is of course going to be affected. My feelings toward that person, if I'm not forgiving them, are of course going to be affected. But you know what's most affected by unforgiveness? Us. Is that if we refuse to forgive people, we're kind of choosing to be stuck because we keep replaying that event and that pain in our heads over and over again, and we can never really move past it, and which means we can never really move on from what happened. And although we may not know why that happens, the language we use around being harmed kind of paints a picture for us, because when someone harms us, that event creates a debt. That there's something that used to be there that's not there anymore. Meaning, in fact, what language do we use? If someone hurts me, what do I say? They owe me an apology. Right? So if they owe me an apology, it means they've taken something away from me. And I think that's where kind of that additive pain starts to swirl around. That not just does the thing itself hurt, but the fact that something has been taken away from you by someone else makes it hurt even more. And the thing is that depending on what someone takes can really impact the level of pain. Like in my case, they took the newness of my car away, but it's just a thing. But what happens when someone takes something from you that impacts your well-being? Someone takes something from you that can't be restored. Or if someone does something that takes your dignity away from you. How do we recover from that? And what ends up happening is that that situation has created inequity, right? Things are just out of balance. And what we tend to think, I think, is that if we're willing to hold the fault against them, in other words, we're not willing to forgive them, we think that our tendency is to think that you've taken something from me, that's created an imbalance. I'm going to try to restore the balance by holding a grudge against you. That somehow I think I'm reclaiming power in some way by holding that against you. But the reality is the exact opposite is true. That holding on to that grudge does not add to our power. It does not restore the balance. It actually amplifies the imbalance and makes things worse. So we're the ones that are most affected because think of all the energy we spend on holding a grudge on someone. If you're upset with someone, think about how much you think about that issue. As long as we're holding on to that pain, we replay it in our heads over and over again. We talk about it with other people. So what we do to ourselves is we actually force ourselves, by not forgiving, to keep living this pain over and over again. And then think about what you feel like when you run into that person. And all the ways you feel and all the things you think and how hard you think about what they've done to you. And think about how you talk to that person. And I also think about how much energy do we expend trying not to run into that person, trying not to talk to that person. And so what ends up happening is that this thing that we thought was going to give us power, holding a grudge, is just sucking the life out of us. And it's multiplying our pain. And ultimately it becomes a drain. But what it really comes down to is that the thought of forgiving just seems like too much. And although I think that is a very rational and very real response to being hurt, what we don't want to do is let the emotion take over on us. That what we should do, if we can, is we want to step back a little bit. And we want to say that, let me try to think about this logically. Now, of course, the issue is that we're talking about emotions and logic. And if you pit emotion against logic, which one always wins? Emotion. Emotion always wins. So we want to do our best to kind of step out of that emotion and realize that refusing to forgive someone does not make things any better. And one of the reasons I think that we tend to want to hold on to a grudge is we think that having a grudge will make us feel better. But it doesn't, at least not for very long. That there might be some fleeting moment of, yeah, I feel better, I'm better than them, I'm smarter than them, they're dumber than me, whatever it might be. But in time, that passes too. Ultimately, unforgiveness takes a really bad situation and it makes it worse. And we just kind of start spinning on that. And the thing that we want to understand is that this person, the person who is most hurt by our unforgiveness, is us. There's a kind of well-known phrase around that idea. It says that unforgiveness is like drinking poison, hoping it will kill your enemy. So we are actually inducing toxicity on ourselves under the misguided belief that this unforgiveness is going to impact their lives in some way. But that is an illusion. It doesn't really harm them. I mean, how often do we hold a grudge against a person for years who doesn't even know we're upset with them? Right? Clearly it's not affecting them, although I may think about it every morning when I wake up. Right? Or every time I see something, or every time that gap in my driver's side door is off by a little bit. Right? I keep replaying it over and over again. So that's why we tend to refuse to forgive, that we think that we're somehow going to grab that power. But I guess the question is that I can explain all of this to you, and someone else can explain it to me, and we can read all kinds of books about it. But forgiving people is still really hard. And why is that? I think what it comes down to is that we have this tendency to feel like that if we forgive someone, we're actually allowing ourselves to lose a second time. That whenever they did what they did, we lost something because they did something to us. And if we forgive them, we feel like we're losing again. That we were hoping to gain some kind of advantage, and we can't do it. And I think that what tends to happen is that we can tend to feel like if we forgive someone, we're giving up our rights. That we have this tendency to believe that if I say I forgive someone, what I'm saying is what they did is okay. We can believe that's what we're saying. That if I forgive them, I'm pretending it didn't happen. And the thing that I want us all to understand is that that is not at all what forgiveness means. So I want to take a couple minutes and talk about what does forgiveness actually mean. But before we do that, let's talk about what forgiveness does not mean, because it's so important to understand what it doesn't mean, because I think that if we can internalize what it doesn't mean, it's easier to grasp what it does mean. The most important thing to understand is that forgiving someone does not mean that they did not hurt you. Your pain is real. What was done to you is real. Your loss is real. Forgiveness does not change that. When we forgive someone, we're not saying what they did is all right. Also, forgiving someone does not mean we have to forget. Now, we often toss out a phrase, forgive and forget. Not possible in a lot of situations. And to pretend that we're forgetting is to set ourselves up for further pain, because you're going to see things that trigger that memory. So pretending that we've forgotten is not going to help anything. So forgiving someone does not mean we are forced to forget. But it does mean we're not going to dwell on it. We're not going to try to replay it over and over again. Another key thing, forgiving someone does not mean you expose yourself to further harm. If you were ever in an abusive relationship, forgiving the person who abused you does not mean you have to go back to that person. It does not mean that you spend time alone with that person. We're moving on from the abuse, but we do not expose ourselves to further harm. And if the person did something that is illegal, it does not mean they don't face justice. So forgiveness does not mean any of those things. So what is it then? Forgiveness is the willingness to turn it over, to turn the issue over to God and say that I can't control this. I can't manage this. This is hurting me too much by holding on to it. As we think about this idea of forgiveness and unforgiveness, that we can have this illusion that holding on to unforgiveness gives us power over the situation. That I'm going to hold this against you and somehow I have power against you, which isn't true. And what ultimately happens, if we hold on to unforgiveness, the unforgiveness takes power over us because it becomes bitterness, it becomes darkness, it becomes something that grabs onto us, that the more we dwell on it, the more it takes hold of us. So what we're saying is that if we try to think in terms of unforgiveness, we're grabbing onto a power that we can't hold anyway. It holds us. So what we're going to do instead is turn it over to the one who does have the power. That we're going to surrender it to God. And we're going to hand it over to him and let him take it from here. But even though we're surrendering it to God, I do think that there's a few actions of our own that should follow as we do that. The one thing we want to do is that as we surrender this to God, we want to make a conscious decision to not seek revenge over the person, to not hold it over the person, that we're not going to try to throw it in their face. In fact, what the Apostle Paul tells us says, never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. What we need to understand is that if we start doing things like plotting revenge against someone, or sometimes we play out these scenarios in our head of all the horrible things that we would wish would happen to them, that's plotting evil. Right? That is allowing your mind to dwell on evil things. And evil things get a hold of us. So what we want to do is make sure that we're not just kind of replaying thoughts in our heads, not behaving in a way that ultimately drags us down. Because that's the warning here, is that when we focus on committing evil to others, even if we never really plan to actually do it, we just kind of wish it would happen, that grabs a hold of us. And that drags us down. And as we forgive someone, and we turn it over to God, we make that decision, as I mentioned before, to stop dwelling on it, that we're not going to keep going over it, not going to keep going over it over and over again. But again, the thing that I want to make really clear, as you forgive someone, as you turn this over to God, it never means your loss isn't real. Your pain is real. And it's so important to recognize that is true, that so often people, when we're struggling, people will say, well, just move on, forget about it, don't worry about it. And that minimizes our pain. It minimizes our suffering. We need to acknowledge the pain that we've had. We just don't want to dwell on it. And so when we say that we're forgiving someone and we turn this over to God, if you're struggling to do that, I would encourage you to say something like this to God. God, I can't control this situation. I'm going to trust you to. I'm going to stop trying to control this myself. I want to turn this over to you. And the thing I want to encourage you about the most is that you do not have to be nice to God. He can take it. If you're hurting, tell him that you are hurting. If you are angry, you tell him how angry you are. If you're struggling to give it over to him, say, I don't really want to give this to you, but I'm going to try. And I know I'm going to get it wrong sometimes. I'm going to come back and say, you know what? I'm still hanging on to it. But it's that honesty of relationship that allows us to step into the life that comes with an active relationship with God. Because God doesn't want us to pretend that we're okay. When we're not okay, he wants to talk with us about it. He wants to be in it with us. And when someone hurts us, we're not okay. And when someone hurts us, letting go of it is really hard sometimes. And so we walk that out with him. And the beauty that we have is that the foundation of our faith is built on Jesus. And the amazing thing about Jesus is that he has experienced every bit of pain that we do. That he walked in a human body, and he dealt with those limitations, and he knew what it was like to be pushed out. He knew what it was like to be rejected. He knew what it was like to be hurt. The writer of Hebrews puts it this way. It says, this high priest of ours. Now, the writer of Hebrews, when he uses this term, the high priest of ours, who he's referring to is Jesus. So what he says is that Jesus understands our weakness because he faced all of the same things we do, yet he did not sin. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy. We will find grace to help us when we need it most. Jesus experienced the same pain we do. And he knows what it's like to have a hard situation to forgive. And he knows that struggle, and he knows that even to do what he did, he had to be in connection with God. And that's what we're called to do. So as we go forward, I encourage each of us to embrace this reality that most of us are carrying some kind of pain that we've never let go of. The way we let go of it is to forgive, something we often cannot do by ourselves. So step into that relationship with God, to turn that pain over to him and trust him to bring us through that.